"You useless old woman! Get down there and clean it up!" Thaddeus's voice cracked across the dining room like a whip, and 20 heads turned toward me at once. 20 pairs of eyes, every one of them fixed on me. Muriel Hartley, 69 years old, still wearing the stained apron I had put on at 5 o'clock that morning, standing frozen at the head of a Thanksgiving table I had spent 14 hours building with my own 2 hands. The lobster platter was already on the floor. He had swept it off the table himself, one sharp motion of his arm, and the most expensive dish in the room shattered across the hardwood. The sauce spread in long red streaks over the floor I had scrubbed the day before the floor of the house I had built 1 brick at a time with Elwood, the house I had clawed back from the bank through years of sleepless nights after he died. And now my own son stood in the middle of it, shaking with a rage that seemed to feed on itself, pointing a finger at my face in front of 20 people I barely knew. "I gave you 1 job," he said, and his voice dropped low, that cold, quiet tone that frightened me more than the shouting ever could. "1. And you couldn't even do that. You humiliated me. In my own house." His house. I wanted to ask him who the allergic guest was, and why no one, not one single person, had thought to tell me. I had asked. That was the part that burned. 2 days before standing in this very kitchen with his menu in my hand, I had asked him plainly, "Is anyone coming who can't eat shellfish? Anyone with allergies so I can make a separate dish?" And he had waved me off without looking up from his phone. "Just cook what I gave you, Mom. Stop fussing over nothing." I had cooked exactly what he gave me. Every dish on this table came from the list he wrote himself. The seafood he insisted on because he wanted to impress the man sitting at the far end. Now the business partner with the gray suit and the tight, embarrassed mouth. The man who had taken 1 bite set down his fork and quietly said he was allergic. I watched the color drain out of my son's face when that happened. I watched the panic flicker behind his eyes, the realization that he had forgotten that the mistake was his and his alone, that he had failed to warn the one person who could have fixed it. And then I watched him do the thing that broke something in me forever. He turned that mistake around and laid it on my shoulders. "I told you," he said loud enough for the whole table to hear. "I told you days ago and you still made it anyway." Then he turned to his guests with a sigh, with a soft apologetic shake of the head, and he smiled the way a man smiles when he is about to be cruel and wants it to look like patience. "I'm so sorry, everyone. My mother, she's not what she used to be. She forgets things, gets confused. I went over all of this with her and it just doesn't stick anymore. You know how it is at her age." At her age. The words landed on me like stones. A nervous laugh rippled across the table. Someone murmured something about their own mother. A woman near the tree turned her face away, unable to watch. And not one of them stood up. Not one of them said a word. "Take off the apron," Thaddeus said. "Get on your knees. Clean it." The room held its breath. I felt every eye on the back of my neck. And I, Muriel Hartley, who had raised this boy alone, who had sold my wedding ring so he could go to school. I untied my apron with hands that would not stop shaking, lowered myself onto the cold hardwood, and began to wipe the red sauce from the floor at my son's feet. "And no dinner for you tonight?" His voice came down from somewhere above my head, as bored and even as a man giving an order to a servant. "Maybe an empty stomach will help you remember next time." I bowed my head lower so none of them could see my eyes. I would not cry. Not in front of these people. Not tonight. I gripped the rag and I worked, and the heat of 20 silent stares pressed against my back. And somewhere underneath, the shame and the exhaustion, and the long red streaks soaking into the cracks of my own hardwood floor, something that had been asleep in me for 3 years stirred for the first time. A small crack. Almost too faint to feel, but it was there. And though I did not know it yet, that crack would one day become an earthquake that swallowed everything. I did not always live like this. That is the part people never understand. There was a time not so long ago when this was simply my home, and I was simply Muriel, and no one in it spoke to me the way my son had just spoken to me on Thanksgiving night. 3 years ago, Thaddeus came to my door with Marlene and the 2 children, Ruby, who was 3 then, and Henry, who was barely 1, and he asked me with that smile he used to have the real one if they could stay for a few months. Just until we save for a place of our own, Mom. The market is impossible. You know how it is. It won't be long, I promise. And I, like the fool I was, opened the door as wide as it would go. Of course, I told him. This will always be your home. Stay as long as you need. We are family. How blind I was. The months turned into a year. The year turned into 2, and then into 3, and somewhere along the way, without my ever being able to point to the exact moment it happened, I stopped being the mother and became the help. Thaddeus worked late, so I made dinner. Marlene had her clients and her showings, so I watched the children. The house was large, so I cleaned every corner of it. They had busy and important lives, meetings and deals and people to impress, so I took care of everything else. The laundry, the groceries, the dishes, the bathrooms, the yard, the school runs, the lunches packed before sunrise. And every time my exhaustion showed on my face, every time I dared to say I needed an afternoon to myself, Thaddeus had an answer ready, perfectly shaped to make me feel small. It's one small favor, Mom. I thought you loved spending time with your grandchildren. It's not a big deal, it's just a little help. At your age, it's not as if you have much else going on. And I nodded. Because that is how I was raised. Because a mother helps. Because family comes first, and my own needs could always wait. They could always wait. They took the master bedroom, the one Elwood and I had shared for the 30 years of our marriage. They needed the space, they said. They had to work from home sometimes and required somewhere quiet. And I understood, of course. I always understood. I moved my whole life into the small room at the back of the house that used to be my sewing room, the one barely larger than a closet where my clothes hung on a rack because there was no space for a wardrobe, and my books sat stacked in boxes on the floor, while my son and his wife spread out across the rest of my house as though it were theirs by right. People in the neighborhood would have looked at us and seen a generous family taking in their elderly mother. That is what Thaddeus wanted them to see. That is what Marlene posted on her pages, photographs of our beautiful home, our lovely Thanksgiving, never once mentioning whose home it actually was, never once mentioning who had paid for it in blood. Because they did not know what it had cost me. Most people did not. Elwood died when Thaddeus was 12. A sudden thing, a heart that simply stopped one ordinary morning at the breakfast table, and there was no time for goodbyes, no time to prepare. One day he was laughing over his coffee, and the next I was standing in front of his casket trying to explain to a 12-year-old boy why his father was never coming home. We were left alone, a widow of 43 and a half grown child, and a mountain of debt I did not know existed until the letters started arriving. Building the house had cost more than we ever told anyone. Elwood had taken loans against his little machine shop, certain it would grow enough to cover everything. It did not grow, and I was left with the bills, with men knocking at the door with a mortgage that threatened to take the only roof we had. But I did not let it happen. I took the only work I could find that paid steady wages and gave me a kitchen to stand in, because cooking was the one thing in this world I knew how to do better than almost anyone. I became a cook in the cafeteria of the county hospital, and then in time the head of that kitchen, feeding hundreds of people a day, the sick and the grieving and the doctors who never learned my name. I worked doubles. I came home with my feet swollen and my hands raw, and I did it again the next morning. For years I slept 4 hours a night, so that the house would stay in my name, and my son would not have to leave his school or his friends or the only life he had ever known. I sold my wedding ring, the one Elwood had saved 3 months to buy. I sold the pearl necklace my own mother left me. Every small thing I owned that had any value at all, I turned into tuition and uniforms and books. And when Thaddeus finished school with honors and went off to study finance, I took one more loan, this one against the house itself, that house I had fought so hard to keep, and I paid for every semester of it. I paid it all back, every dollar, year by year, until the deed was clean again, and the house was mine, free and whole, with nothing owed to anyone. There was something else I had, though it took me years to understand its worth. When my mother passed, she left me a small piece of land back in the town where I was born, a quiet half-acre that had been in the family longer than I had been alive. I held on to it for a long time out of sentiment. But after Elwood died with the debts pressing in, I sold it. It was not a fortune. It was enough to put aside a small reserve I had built carefully over the years, and added to, whenever I could, the only true savings I had managed to keep through all of it. Money from my mother's hands set aside for the years when my own hands would no longer be able to work. It sat in an account I rarely touched, and I thought of it when I thought of it at all as the one safe thing I had left in the world. Thaddeus knew about that account. Of course he did. He was a financial advisor. 3 years ago, when they first moved in, he had sat me down at the kitchen table with that earnest, helpful face and told me he wanted to take some of the burden off me, that he could manage my paperwork, keep an eye on my accounts, make sure nothing slipped through the cracks at my age. "Let me handle the boring parts, Mom," he had said. "You've worked hard enough." And I had been grateful. I had signed the papers he put in front of me, several of them, without reading every line, because I trusted my son, and because I was tired down to my bones, and because it never once crossed my mind that the boy I had raised would ever do me harm. That trust was the door I left open. I just did not know it yet. The morning after Thanksgiving, I was up before the sun, as I always was, scraping the last of the dried sauce from between the floorboards on my hands and knees while the rest of the house slept. By the time Marlene came down for her coffee, I had the kitchen spotless and breakfast warming, and she walked past me without a word, her eyes on her phone as though I were a piece of the furniture that had learned to make eggs. The mail came a little after 10. I gathered it from the box the way I always did, sorting it on the hall table into the piles I had been taught to keep his and hers and the bills and the rest. And in among the envelopes was one I almost set aside without looking, a letter from the bank, the kind of thing I usually left for Thaddeus since he handled the boring parts now. But this one had my name on it. Muriel Hartley, printed clean across the front. So I opened it. It was a routine notice, the sort a bank sends without thinking, the sort that should never have reached me at all, because by every arrangement my son had made it should have gone straight to him. A confirmation. A summary of recent activity on the savings account my mother's land had paid for. And there, in the plain gray type, was a record of a withdrawal I had never made on a date when I had been standing in that kitchen feeding the people my son wanted to impress. And beneath it, authorizing it, was a signature. My signature. I had not signed it. I stood in the hallway of my own house with that single sheet of paper trembling in my hands, reading those few lines again and again, and the floor seemed to tilt very slowly beneath my feet. The handwriting was close. Someone had studied the way I shaped my letters and had practiced. But I knew my own hand the way I knew my own face, and I knew with a certainty that turned my blood to ice that I had never put my name to that page in my life. My money was leaving my account, and someone had been signing my name to let it go. I do not know how long I stood there. Long enough that my legs began to ache. Long enough that the coffee I had poured for myself went cold on the table where I had left it. The house was quiet around me. Marlene had gone out to a showing. Thaddeus was somewhere upstairs in the room he called his office, the one that had once been Elwood's, on a call I could hear only as a low murmur through the ceiling. The children were at school. For the first time in 3 years, I was alone in my own home, and the silence felt different now, heavier, like a held breath. I made myself sit down. I made myself read the letter a 4th time slowly, the way I would read a recipe when the stakes were high, and a mistake could not be undone. And as I read, the memory rose up in me with a new and terrible meaning. those papers, the ones he had slid across the kitchen table 3 years ago with his earnest face and his soft voice. "Let me handle the boring parts, Mom." I had signed them without my glasses half asleep, trusting the boy I had carried in my own body. I had never asked what they were. I had never thought I needed to ask. Now I understood. He had not asked to manage my paperwork to lighten my load. He had asked for a key, and I had handed it to him, smiling grateful, and shut the door behind it. A part of me, the part that had spent 3 years bowing its head and swallowing its words, wanted to climb the stairs that very moment, to knock on that door, and put the letter in his hands and ask him to explain, certain there would be an explanation, certain my son could not have done this thing. But I did not move. Something colder and older than that frightened part of me held me still in the chair, because I already knew the way you know a storm is coming before the first drop falls, that if I let him see this letter, he would have an answer ready before I finished the sentence. He always had an answer ready. He was good with words and good with numbers and good at making me feel that the fault was mine. So I did not go upstairs. I folded the letter along its creases, slid it into the pocket of my apron, and pressed my hand flat against it until my heartbeat slowed. Then I picked up my cold coffee, carried it to the sink, and poured it out, and I stood there a moment looking at my own reflection in the dark window above the basin. An old woman with tired eyes and raw red hands. For the first time in a very long time, that woman did not look away. For 3 days I said nothing. I cooked the breakfasts and packed the lunches and drove the children to school, and I watched. I had spent 3 years moving through that house like a ghost, invisible beneath notice, and I understood now that invisibility could be a kind of armor. No one watches the furniture. So I watched them instead. I noticed how Thaddeus took his calls behind a closed door and lowered his voice when I passed in the hall. I noticed the way Marlene's eyes slid over me and away the small impatience in her, as though I were a clock she was waiting to run down. I noticed that the office, the room that had been Elwood's and was now my son's, stayed locked when they were home, and was the one room in the house I was never asked to clean anymore. That last thing told me more than anything. For 3 years I had scrubbed every corner of that house, every bathroom, every baseboard. And only this year had that one door begun to stay shut to me. People do not lock away what they are proud of. The letter stayed folded in my apron pocket against my heart where I could feel it whenever my courage failed. And on the 4th night, when Thaddeus had taken Marlene to a dinner in the city, and the children were asleep, and the house was finally completely still, I took the spare key from the hook in the pantry where it had hung since the day I first held the deed to that house in my own name, and I unlocked the office door, and I went in. I told myself I was only going to look. I told myself I would find some innocent thing, some explanation, and the cold weight in my chest would lift, and I would feel foolish in the morning. I turned on the small desk lamp instead of the overhead light, the way a thief would, and the shame of that, of creeping like a criminal in my own home, sat sour in my throat. The desk was neat. Thaddeus was always neat. But neatness, I learned that night, is only another word for organized, and a man who organizes his crimes leaves them in order for anyone with the patience to read. In the bottom drawer, beneath a folder of tax papers, there was another folder thicker unlabeled. I lifted it out with both hands and opened it on the desk under the lamp, and I began to read, and the floor tilted under me the way it had in the hallway 4 days before, only worse. This time, much worse. There were bank statements going back more than 2 years. My statements, my mother's land turned into numbers on a page, and the numbers grew smaller and smaller down the months. Withdrawal after withdrawal, transfer after transfer, money moving out of my account and into another. I did not recognize an investment account in Marlene's name. My signature was on the authorizations, that careful forgery, page after page of it. They had not taken my savings all at once. They had bled it slowly, the way you bleed something you do not want to notice it is dying. But the savings were only the beginning. Underneath the statements were the rest of it. There was an appraisal of the house. My house valued measured reduced to a figure on a sheet $340,000, as though Elwood and I had not built it, as though I had not bought it back from the bank with 20 years of my life. There was a draft of a deed, a transfer of ownership with a line at the bottom waiting for my name. There were printed brochures, glossy and pale, for places with soft names. Cedar something, Willow something, residences for seniors with sections circled in my son's handwriting about memory care and supervised living and monthly costs of $3,000 and $4,000. And there was one more page, and that was the page that took the air out of my lungs and did not give it back. It was a letter, a draft addressed to a doctor my son knew, asking for an evaluation. An evaluation of his mother, who he was sorry to say had been declining for some time now, growing confused, forgetful, unable to manage her own affairs, who needed for her own safety to be assessed for cognitive decline. He had written down the symptoms he wanted found. He had even written down the dates he claimed to have noticed them, and one of those dates was a Thanksgiving. This Thanksgiving, the night he stood in front of 20 people and told them I was not what I used to be. I understood then that it had not been an insult thrown in anger. It had been a brick. He had been laying them for months, one at a time, in front of witnesses, building the wall that would one day hold me in. The nursing home was not the prize. The house was the prize, and the savings, and whatever else of mine he could reach. The cognitive decline, the soft place with the circled costs, those were only the road that led there. Declare the mother senile take her hand for the papers she could no longer be trusted to understand, move her somewhere quiet, and let the house become his. My son had drawn me a map of my own disappearance. I do not know how long I sat in that chair with the lamp burning and the folder open in front of me. Long enough that my hands stopped shaking and went very still and very cold. And in that stillness, I did the only useful thing I could think to do. I took out my phone, that old phone Thaddeus was always ashamed of, and I photographed every page. The statements, the forged signatures, the appraisal, the deed, the brochures, the letter to the doctor. Every single sheet, slowly, carefully, my hands steadier than they had any right to be. Then I closed the folder, set it back in the drawer beneath the tax papers, exactly as I had found it, turned off the lamp, and locked the door behind me. If they learned that I knew, they would only move faster. I understood that much. Whatever I was going to do, it would have to be done before they finished what they had started, and it would have to be done quietly, and I could not do it alone. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my small room at the back of the house, the room that used to be where I sewed, and I stared at the ceiling and listened to the children breathing through the wall, and I thought about the woman in the dark window above the sink, the one who had not looked away. By the time the sky began to gray at the edges of the curtain, I had made a decision. I was not going to vanish. I was not going to sign anything. But I was not going to be a fool either, charging upstairs to confront two people who knew more about money and the law than I would ever know. If I was going to fight, I needed someone in my corner who understood the rules of the fight. And I knew exactly who to ask first. Pearl Dawson had lived across the fence from me for 40 years. She had brought a casserole the week Elwood died, and she had never once in all the years since stopped checking on me. She was 71 now, a widow like me, but there was a brightness in her that I felt I had lost somewhere along the way. At 6:45, while my son still slept in the room that had been mine, I walked the short path to her door, where she stood every morning in her robe, watering the pots on her step. She took one look at my face and set the watering can down. "Muriel," she said, "come inside. Sit down." I did not sit. I stood in the middle of her warm little living room, and I let it all out, 3 days of it, 3 years of it. The letter, the folder, the forged signatures, and the appraisal, and the brochures, and the letter to the doctor. The plan to call me senile and take my house and put me away somewhere with a soft name and a circled price. The words came out of me in a flood, everything I had been holding behind my teeth, and when there was nothing left to say, Pearl put her arms around me and held me while I cried in a way I had not cried in years. Not the silent tears of the kitchen, something deeper and angrier than that. "I knew," she said quietly when my crying had calmed. "Not all of it, not this. But I knew something was wrong in that house. The whole street has known for a long time, Muriel. The way he speaks to you. The night of that party, I had my window open and I heard him. We all heard him." She pulled back and looked at me with those clear eyes that had always seen more than I wanted them to. "What is happening to you has a name, and the name is not family. It is abuse. And you are not going to face it alone because I know someone who can help you." She made me a cup of coffee with hands that did not shake. And while I drank it, she told me about a woman named Naomi Foster, a lawyer who did not handle the ordinary business of wills and divorces, but something more particular, the rights of older people, the kind of quiet cruelty that happens behind closed doors in respectable houses, the fraud and the coercion, and the slow theft of everything a person had built. Pearl had met her years ago through a friend at her church whose own children had tried something similar, smaller but the same shape. She found the number in a worn address book, and she picked up her phone, and she called right there in front of me, and she spoke to someone for several minutes in plain and steady words. When she hung up, she looked at me and said, "She'll see you the day after tomorrow, 10 o'clock. Her office is downtown, and I'm going with you." Naomi Foster's office was in an old brick building with a bakery on the ground floor, and the whole place smelled faintly of bread. She came out to meet us herself, a woman of perhaps 40, with steady eyes and a calm that settled over the room the moment she walked into it. She sat me down, poured me a glass of water, and said, "Mrs. Hartley, take your time and tell me everything." So I did. I told her all of it the way I had told Pearl, and when I came to the photographs, she asked very gently if she might see them. I handed her my phone, and she went through every image, slowly enlarging them, reading every line, her face giving nothing away. The bank statements, the forged signatures, the deed waiting for my name, the letter to the doctor. When she had seen them all, she set the phone down on the desk between us and folded her hands. "Mrs. Hartley," she said, "I want to be very clear with you about what I am looking at because I think you have been made to feel for a long time that you are imagining things or overreacting or that this is simply how families are. It is not. What your son is doing to you is not a misunderstanding, and it is not your fault. Forging your signature to move money out of your accounts is fraud. Doing it while holding a power of attorney he obtained from you under false pretenses makes it worse, not better. And arranging to have you falsely declared incompetent in order to take your home is financial exploitation of an elder, and it is a crime in this state, a serious one." She paused. "I have seen a great many of these cases, and I want you to know that the people who do this almost always believe they will get away with it, because they count on their victims being too tired, too ashamed, and too alone to fight back. You are tired, and you have been made ashamed, but you are not alone anymore. So now we are going to make very sure he does not get away with it." I felt something move in my chest that I had not felt in 3 years. It took me a moment to recognize it, because it had been gone so long. It was hope. "Here is what we are going to do," Naomi said, and she took out a clean notepad and began to write, and her voice was quiet and certain, the voice of someone who has walked this path before and knows where every stone is. "First, we build the record, and we build it on paper because paper does not get confused, and paper does not lose its nerve on the witness stand. You have already done the hardest part by photographing those documents. From here, you keep every receipt for anything you pay for in that house. You keep a quiet, dated note of the things that happen. We do not rely on anything that could be argued away. We rely on what is written. Second, and this matters more than anything else, you do not let him see that you know. Not a word, not a look. People like your son are most dangerous in the moment they realize they have lost control, And if he learns the ground is shifting under him before we are ready, he will move faster, and he may do something rash. So you go home today, and you cook his dinner, and you watch his children exactly as you have, and you let him go on believing that you are the tired, beaten woman he thinks you are. It will be the hardest acting you have ever done. Can you do it? I thought of the night on the floor, the red sauce, the 20 faces turned away. I thought of the woman in the dark window who had not looked away. For 3 years I said I have been pretending I did not mind. I can pretend a little longer. Something passed across Naomi's face that was almost a smile. Good, she said. Then while you are pretending, I will be working. There are things I can do that he will not see and cannot feel until it is too late for him to undo them. There are protections we can put in place around your money and your home quietly from the outside. There are people whose job it is to investigate exactly this kind of thing. And there is a family of yours, your husband's people, that I suspect has been kept away from you on purpose, who deserve to know the truth, and who may stand beside you when the time comes. We are going to do all of it, carefully, in the right order. And one day when it is ready, you are going to stand in your own house, the house you built and bought and bled for, and you are going to take it back. Pearl reached over and took my hand. Naomi capped her pen and looked at me across the desk, and for the first time since Thanksgiving night, I did not feel like something that had been left on the floor. I felt like Muriel Hartley. Pearl drove me home in the early afternoon, and we were quiet most of the way, the kind of quiet that does not need filling. Near my street, she slowed the car and looked over at me. You're going to walk back into that house, she said, and you're going to have to look at his face and make him your dinner. I don't know how you're going to do it. I told her the truth, which was that I did not know either, only that I would. She squeezed my arm and let me out at the corner so that no one would see whose car had brought me. I went in through this kitchen door. Thaddeus was home at the counter with his laptop, and he glanced up at me with that flat and curious look he gave the furniture. "Where were you?" he asked, not because he cared, but because he liked to know that I would answer. "The doctor," I said, "for my knees." The lie came out smooth and small, and I was almost surprised at how easily it sat in my mouth. He had taught me, after all, that I was forgetful, confused, not what I used to be. Let him believe his own story a little longer. He had already looked back at his screen. "Marlene's partners are coming Thursday. 8 of them. We'll need the good plates." "Of course," I said, and I tied on my apron, the one with the bank letter still folded in the pocket against my heart, and I took the meat out of the refrigerator and began to cook the dinner for the man who was planning to make me disappear. The hardest part of the war, I would learn, was not the fighting. It was the smiling. Thursday came, and with it 8 of Marlene's colleagues and I cooked for all of them with the bank letter folded in my apron and a calm in my hands I did not recognize as my own. This was the war Naomi had described, and I had thought it would feel like fear. It did not. It felt like patience. I moved among them, filling glasses and clearing plates, invisible as ever, and for the first time in 3 years, I was glad to be invisible, because no one watches the woman with the serving tray, and a woman no one watches can hear a great deal. I heard more than they knew. I heard the way Marlene laughed a little too loudly when a man asked how her latest fund was performing, and the way she changed the subject. I heard Thaddeus by the window, his voice low and tight, telling someone he would have the money in a matter of weeks, that it was tied up. But it was coming, that he simply needed a little more time. I refilled his guest's glass, and he did not even glance at me, and I carried that sentence back into the kitchen and turned it over and over while I washed the plates. A little more time. The man who was planning to declare me senile and take my house was, it seemed, in a great hurry to do it. And men who steal are not in a hurry unless something is chasing them. I told Naomi this 2 days later in her office that smelled of bread, and she wrote it down without surprise. "It usually comes down to one of 2 things," she said. "Greed or fear. The greedy ones take their time. The frightened ones make mistakes. If your son is in a hurry, Muriel, then somewhere behind him there is a fire, and I would very much like to know what it is." While she went looking for the fire, the quiet war went on. I did exactly as she had told me. I kept every receipt for the groceries I bought with my own pension money, the meat and the wine and the school supplies, a small mountain of paper proving who had truly kept that house running. I kept a dated notebook, plain and factual, of the things that were said to me and the work I was made to do. I did not rely on anything that could be argued away later by two people who argued for a living. I relied on what was written exactly as she had taught me. The hardest part was not the keeping of records. It was the smiling. Every morning I came down and made the coffee exactly the way Thaddeus liked it, and folded the paper beside his plate. And I said good morning to the man whose folder I had photographed in the dark, and I did not let my face betray a single thing. Some mornings when he snapped at me over nothing, when Marlene looked through me as though I were glass, the words rose up in my throat so hot and so fast that I had to turn to the sink and run the water just to have somewhere to put my hands. I had spent 3 years swallowing my own voice. Now I swallowed it on purpose, like a soldier holding her position, and it was a different thing entirely, and somehow it cost more. What kept me steady were the children. Ruby was 6 now, and Henry 4, and they were the only 2 people in that house who still looked at me as though I were worth something. In the afternoons, when their parents were out chasing the money that was chasing them, Ruby would climb onto the stool beside me at the counter and help me roll dough with her small, floured hands, and Henry would sit on the floor and tell me long, serious stories about nothing at all. They were innocent in all of this. Whatever their father had become, they had not yet learned it, and part of what I was fighting for was a house they could come back to one day, a grandmother who had not let herself be erased. One afternoon, Ruby looked up at me with flour on her nose and said out of nowhere, "Grandma, are you really forgetting things?" And something in the careful way she asked it made my hands go still on the dough. I told her, "No, sweetheart, Grandma remembers everything." She nodded slowly, as if she were filing the answer away somewhere, and went back to her rolling, and I did not think much of it then. I would think a great deal about it later, and behind the scenes where my son could not see and could not feel it, Naomi worked. She did the things that the law allowed an old woman to do quietly to protect herself, things that left no ripple on the surface of that house. She had me sign a revocation of the power of attorney I had given Thaddeus 3 years before the key I had handed him without knowing, and she recorded it with the county so that it became a matter of public record. She placed a fraud alert on my accounts and had what remained of my savings quietly frozen so that not another dollar of my mother's land could leave without my knowing. She filed a report careful and documented with the county office that investigates exactly this kind of harm to older people. A quiet woman named Renee Coleman, who opened a file and watched and waited. None of it made a sound. Thaddeus came down to breakfast each morning, believing he held all the cards, and he no longer held a single one, and he did not know it. It was Naomi who found the fire. She called me on a gray afternoon and asked me to come in, and when I sat down across from her, she did not pour the water first, the way she usually did. She simply looked at me. "I found out why your son is in such a hurry," she said. "He is under investigation. The kind of investigation that ends careers and sometimes ends in handcuffs. It appears he has been moving client money in ways he was not permitted to, covering one hole by digging another, and the regulators have begun to ask questions he cannot answer. And Marlene is no better. That fund she would not talk about at your dinner has collapsed, and they owe a great deal of money to people who are not patient. They are not stealing from you because they are cruel, Muriel, although they are cruel. They are stealing from you because they are drowning, and your house and your savings are the only thing left within their reach that is worth enough to keep their heads above the water." I sat with that for a long moment. I had spent 3 years believing I was a burden grudgingly carried. Now I understood I had been something else the whole time. I had been a lifeboat, and they had been quietly drilling holes in me, planning to climb in once I had sunk. "There is one more thing," Naomi said, and now her voice changed, softened the way a doctor's voice changes before the worst of the news. When I was tracing the money, I went back further than the last 2 years because I wanted to understand how he first got his hands into your affairs. And I found something that I think you do not know. Something about Elwood. The name went through me like cold water. What about Elwood? She turned her notepad around so I could see it. When your husband died, he left more than the debts you've told me about. There was a benefit, Muriel. A survivor's benefit tied to his work that for one reason or another was never claimed at the time. In all the chaos of his death with the creditors and the funeral, and a 12-year-old to raise it slipped through. It sat unclaimed for years the way these things do, waiting for someone to come and find it. And 3 years ago, when your son sat you down at that kitchen table and offered so kindly to manage your affairs, he found it. He had the training to look, and he knew where to look. And instead of bringing it to you, instead of telling his mother that her husband had left her one last gift after all, he claimed it himself in your name, and he took it. I could not speak. I thought of Elwood at the breakfast table, laughing over his coffee on the last ordinary morning of his life. I thought of all the years I had believed he left me only debt, all the nights I sold my rings and worked until my hands bled, because there was nothing else, when all along there had been something else. Something he had meant for me, and our son had reached past my grief and taken it and let me go on believing my husband had left me with nothing, both of them. That was the thought that finally broke through the cold. He had taken the money my mother left me from her land, and he had taken the gift my husband left me from his work. Everything that the dead had tried to leave in my hands, my son had taken out of them. There was no corner of my life, no piece of my past, no person who had ever loved me that he had not been willing to rob. I am so sorry, Naomi said quietly. I debated whether to tell you, but you deserve to know what was done to you. All of it. No, I said, and my voice did not shake. I needed to know. Thank you. That was the day I went to see Frank. Frank was Elwood's younger brother, and I had not sat across a table from him in years, not because I did not love him, but because Thaddeus had made it so. A canceled holiday here, a forgotten invitation there, until somehow the whole of Elwood's family had drifted out of my life, and I had been too tired to notice the current that carried them away. Naomi had told me they had likely been pushed, not lost, and she was right. When I called Frank and asked if I could meet him somewhere away from the house, he came that same afternoon, and when I told him everything sitting in the back of a quiet diner with my photographs spread across the table, this gray-haired man who looked so much like the husband I had buried put his face in his hands and wept. "Why didn't you tell us, Muriel?" he said. "Any of us. We would have come." "Because I was ashamed," I said. "Because I thought it was my fault. Because he is my son, and a mother is supposed to endure anything. No." Frank reached across the table and took both my hands in his the way Elwood used to. "No one has to endure that. Not from a stranger, and not from their own blood. Especially not from their own blood." And he promised me, his voice rough, that he would be there when the time came, that all of them would, that I would not stand in that house alone again. And I believed him. I had a family again, gathering quietly in the shadows, and my son did not know that either. The trap closed on a cold morning in the middle of December. I had known it was coming because Naomi had told me how it would come. The desperate do not wait, and 3 days before Thaddeus had begun to soften toward me in a way that turned my stomach precisely because I understood it. He brought me a cup of tea. He asked almost gently how my knees were holding up. And then the night before, he set a folder on the kitchen table and slid it toward me with that earnest, helpful face I had learned to fear. "Mom, I've been thinking," he said. "With everything going on your age, the cost of keeping the house up, I think the smart thing is to put the place into a family trust. It protects you. It protects the kids. It just makes everything simpler. I've had the papers drawn up, and I've got a notary coming by in the morning to make it official. All you have to do is sign. I looked at the papers and I saw them for exactly what they were. The deed to my house, dressed up in soft words, the last brick in the wall he had been building since Thanksgiving. And I did the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. I smiled at him, my son, and I said, "Of course, dear. Whatever you think is best." Then, after he had gone up to bed pleased with himself, I called Naomi from the dark of my little room and told her the notary was coming at 9. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Good. Let him come. He has built you a stage, Muriel, and tomorrow you are going to use it. Do not refuse to sign, not at first. Let him believe right up to the last second that he has won, because the whole street and his own family have spent 3 years being told you are too confused to know what is happening to you, and tomorrow you are going to show one honest man with a stamp that you understand every word of it." She told me exactly what to bring and exactly what to say, and I wrote none of it down because I did not need to. I had been remembering everything for weeks. The notary arrived at 9, a thin, nervous man named Dale Briggs, who would not quite meet my eyes, the kind of man who notarizes whatever he is paid to notarize and asks no questions. Thaddeus had clearly used him before. He set his stamp and his book on the kitchen table, and Thaddeus laid out the papers and uncapped a pen and held it out to me, and the two of them looked at the tired old woman who was finally at last going to sign herself out of her own life. I took the pen, and then I set it down. Before I sign anything, I said I'd like to read every line first. At my age, you understand I'd hate to get confused. Something flickered in Thaddeus's face. It was the first time in 3 years he had heard that particular note in my voice. I reached into the bag at my feet, the old bag he never looked at twice, and I took out a folder of my own, and I laid it on the table beside his. The recorded revocation of the power of attorney stamped by the county. The confirmation of the fraud alert on my accounts. A letter on Naomi Foster's letterhead addressed to whom it may concern, stating that her client Muriel Hartley was of entirely sound mind, that any prior authority granted to Thaddeus Hartley had been revoked of record as of 3 weeks ago, and that any attempt to transfer her property would be challenged and rescinded and reported. "I'd like you to read every line too, Mr. Briggs," I said to the notary, and I slid my folder across the table to him instead of taking the pen. Dale Briggs read it. I watched the color leave his face the way it had left my son's on Thanksgiving night. He looked at the county stamp and the lawyer's letterhead and the word fraud, and he understood in an instant that whatever he had been paid to do this morning, he was now being asked to do it in writing with his own name and seal into a documented crime that a real attorney was already watching. He stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. "I'm sorry," he said, gathering his stamp with shaking hands. "I can't. I won't be part of this." And he was gone out the door before Thaddeus could say a word. The kitchen was very quiet. Thaddeus stood holding the useless pen, staring at the folder on the table at the stamp and the letterhead, and I watched the truth arrive on his face in pieces, that the power of attorney was gone, that the accounts were frozen, that a lawyer he had never heard of knew his name, that his mother had been holding all of this, smiling, cooking his dinners, watching his children for weeks while he believed he had already won. He raised his eyes to me at last, and for the first time in 3 years he truly looked at me, and what he saw was not the tired, beaten, forgetful woman he had told 20 people about on Thanksgiving night. What he saw was Muriel Hartley standing in her own kitchen, in her own house, entirely in her right mind, holding the one thing he had been so certain she would never have. "Mom," he said, and his voice had gone strange and small. "What did you do?" "I read every line," I said, "just like you taught me. A cornered man does not surrender. He thrashes." And for the next several days, my son thrashed. The morning after the notary fled, the tears came first. Thaddeus found me in the kitchen, and his eyes were red, and his voice was soft and broken. And he told me he had never meant any of it, that he had only ever been worried about my health, that everything had gotten away from him, and he did not know how. 3 years ago, those tears would have undone me. I would have folded certain that I was the cruel one, the one breaking the family. But I had watched this man cry on demand in front of judges and dinner guests, and I knew the difference now between a wound and a performance. I let him finish. Then I said, "You have until the end of the week," and I went back to peeling the potatoes. When the tears failed, the threats came. He told me that if I did this, if I went through with it, I would never see Ruby and Henry again, that he would take them somewhere I could not follow, and they would grow up not knowing my name. That one found its mark. My hands shook over the sink for an hour after he said it. But Naomi had warned me it would come, and she had told me the truth that steadied me that a grandmother has rights too, that no court rewards a man for using his children as a weapon, and that a threat made in desperation is the sound of a man who has already lost. So I held my position. Marlene took a different road and began telling the neighbors and anyone else who would listen that poor Muriel had grown confused, that the family was heartbroken to be dealing with her decline. She did not know that the street had stopped believing her a long time ago. She did not know about Pearl. And then Thaddeus brought in a lawyer of his own, a smooth man in a good suit, who came to the house and spoke to me in the language men like him use to frighten people who do not know the rules, words about verbal agreements and family residences and the costs of fighting. I let him talk. Then I picked up the phone and called Naomi, and she arrived within the hour with a folder under her arm, and the two of them sat across the table from each other while the smooth man read what she had brought. I watched his confidence drain away page by page the recorded revocation, the frozen accounts, the fraud report, the file already open with the county. When he reached the part about an active investigation into his client's own finances, he closed the folder, said something quiet to Thaddeus, and left. He did not come back. That was when I decided it was time to stop fighting in the dark. I chose a Sunday because Thaddeus and Marlene still lived under my roof, and there was no need to lure anyone anywhere. I simply told my son I had invited some family for the afternoon, and he rolled his eyes and said the more people who saw how well they lived, the better, and he had no idea what was coming through his door. At noon, they began to arrive. Frank first with his 2 brothers behind him, Elwood's people broad and gray and quiet. Then my cousins. Then Pearl, who had stood by me from the first morning. And last, carrying her worn leather bag, Naomi Foster. Marlene came down and saw the number of them, and the color went out of her face. "Mom," she said, "I didn't know you'd invited so many." "Sit down," I said, "both of you." Something in my voice made them obey. They sat together on the sofa, and the rest of the family stood around the room, and I took out my phone, and I connected it to the television the way Naomi had shown me, and I turned to face the 2 people who had spent 3 years trying to erase me. A few weeks ago, I said I found a folder in the office while I was cleaning. I have been keeping a secret ever since. I would like to share it with my family now. And I showed them everything. The bank statements with the forged signatures. The appraisal of my house. The deed waiting for my name. The brochures for the homes with the soft names and the circled prices. The letter to the doctor asking him to find a decline that did not exist with the dates my son had invented, including a Thanksgiving. And then I told them in a steady voice about the savings my mother's land had become drained away, dollar by dollar, and about the gift my husband had left me that I never knew existed until a stranger found it, the gift my own son had reached past my grief and stolen. The room was silent except for the sound of my cousin Linda beginning to cry. "He told 20 people at this table that I was losing my mind," I said. He said it again to the neighbors through his wife. He said it because he needed all of you to believe it, so that one day no one would ask questions when he signed my house out from under me and put me away somewhere quiet. I want every person in this room to look at me now and tell me whether I sound like a woman who is losing her mind. No one said a word because there was nothing to say. Frank had his jaw set so hard I could see the muscle working in it. "This is my house," I said, turning at last to my son. "It has always been my house. You have until next Sunday to return what you have taken and find another place to live. If you go quietly and you make this right, that is the end of it for the sake of those children. If you do not, every page you have just seen goes to the people whose job it is to act on it, and your name goes with it." My voice did not shake. The tears I had cried in that kitchen for 3 years were gone, and in their place was something cold and clear and final. "Do you understand me?" Thaddeus stared at the floor and said nothing. I should have known a man like my son would not take the door I left open. I should have known he would try to kick down a wall instead. 3 days later, Naomi called me, and for the first time since I had met her, her voice was tight. "He has filed for emergency guardianship," she said. "He went to the court and petitioned to have you declared incapacitated, and he attached a physician's certificate to support it. A Dr. Okafor, the same doctor from the letter. He is trying to have a judge strip you of the right to manage your own life today before any of the rest of this can catch up with him." For one long, cold moment, the old fear came back. I sat in my little room with the phone against my ear, and I thought he is going to win. After all, he knows the courts and the words and the doctors, and I am only a cook. And I felt the floor begin to tilt the way it had the night I found the folder. I asked Naomi in a small voice I hated whether he could really do it, and Naomi said no, he cannot, and the fact that he tried may be the best thing that has happened to us. She explained it to me slowly, the way she explained everything until the fear let go of me. Filing a petition is not the same as winning one. No judge takes away a person's rights on the word of one man and one paid certificate. The court would appoint someone independent to meet me, to evaluate me, to see for themselves. And the moment a court began to look closely at the claim that Muriel Hartley was incompetent, it would find a woman of perfectly sound mind with her own attorney and a folder full of evidence that her son was the one who belonged under investigation. The gambit could not work. It could only expose him, and it did, worse than even Naomi predicted. The petition put the whole matter on the record, and the record reached the desk of the quiet woman from the county, Renee Coleman, who had opened her file weeks before and been waiting. Now she had cause to step out of the shadows, and she did. She came to the house herself and sat with me at my own kitchen table and asked me gentle, careful questions, and she watched me make her a cup of coffee and answer every one of them clearly. And she wrote in her file that there was no decline of any kind, and a great deal of evidence of exploitation. And when Dr. Okafor learned that his name was now attached to a guardianship petition in the middle of an active investigation into elder fraud, that he had certified a healthy woman as incompetent for a man who was himself under scrutiny, he did the only thing a frightened man can do. He recanted. He withdrew his certificate, and in withdrawing it, he told them the truth, that Thaddeus Hartley had come to him with the conclusion already written and asked him only to sign his name beneath it. The wall my son tried to kick down fell on him instead. It was Ruby who finished it. Not Naomi, not Renee Coleman, not the doctor. A 6-year-old child with flour on her hands. It happened on the last terrible day when the house was full of the cold quiet of an ending, and Ruby climbed onto the stool beside me at the counter the way she always did, and she watched her father standing rigid by the window and her mother on the phone in the hall. And she said in the small, careful voice of a child who has been carrying something too heavy for her, "Grandma, are you mad at us? Daddy said if anybody asked even the doctor man, we had to say you forget things and you get confused. He made me and Henry practice it, but you don't forget things. I told him you don't. Did I do it wrong?" The kitchen went very still. I knelt down in front of her, my knees protesting the way they always did, and I took her small, floured hands in my old ones, and I told her that she had not done anything wrong, that she had been the bravest and most honest person in the whole house, and that none of it was her fault and never would be. And over the top of her head I looked at my son. Thaddeus had heard every word, and I watched the last of it go out of him, all the rage and the calculation and the smooth lawyer's certainty, until there was nothing left standing in the middle of that room but a man who had finally been forced to see what he had made of himself. He had used his own children to build a lie about his mother. He had made a 6-year-old practice it. And now that same child had said the only true thing anyone had said in that house in 3 years, and there was nowhere left for him to hide from it. He did not beg for himself. I will give him that. He sat down heavily on the sofa and put his face in his hands, and when he finally spoke, his voice was the voice of the boy who used to run to me after a nightmare before the money and the pressure and the ambition buried him. "I don't know who I became," he said. "No," I said, "neither do I. I could have sent him to prison. Naomi told me plainly that I had more than enough to do it, that the forgery alone would be enough, and the exploitation and the fraudulent petition on top of it. For one moment I wanted to. After everything, I wanted to watch the door close on him the way he had planned to close one on me. But then I looked at Ruby and Henry, and I understood that if I did that, I would be carving something into those 2 children that they would carry for the rest of their lives, and I would be doing it for myself, out of a wound the way he had done everything for himself out of his. And I had spent my whole life refusing to become the thing that had hurt me. I was not going to start now. "You will return what you have taken," I told him. "All of it. My savings. Your father's gift. You will sign whatever Naomi puts in front of you, and you will leave this house, and you will deal with the investigation that is coming for you on your own, because that one is past my saving and was always your own doing. I am not going to send you to prison, Thaddeus. Not for your sake. For theirs." I nodded toward the children. "But understand me. I am doing this because I choose to, not because you have earned it. You have not earned it. You may never earn it. And the woman who used to forgive you anything no longer lives in this house." They were gone within the week. The first days after were strange, the way an old silence is strange when it finally lifts. The house felt too large and too quiet at once, and I kept waking before dawn to cook breakfasts no one was waiting for. But slowly I remembered what it was to live in my own home. I moved back into the master bedroom, the one Elwood and I had shared, and I spent 2 days scrubbing every trace of them out of it, and hung my wedding photograph back on the wall where it belonged. Frank and his brothers came on weekends and fixed the things that had been broken for years. The dripping faucet, the sticking door, the garden gone to weeds. Pearl and I painted the kitchen a soft, warm yellow, and she talked me into a dance class on Thursday afternoons, where the 2 of us laughed like girls at how badly we managed the simplest steps. I signed up for a class to learn the kinds of cooking I had never had time for food, made for the joy of it instead of for 100 strangers in a hospital line. The money came back my mother's land and Elwood's last gift, both returned under Naomi's careful eye. The investigation into my son went on without me, slow and grinding the way those things are, his license suspended while the regulators did their work, his name and Marlene's under a scrutiny that would follow them for a long time. I felt no joy in it. I only felt that the world was finally turning the way it was meant to. Thaddeus and I did not reconcile. I do not know that we ever fully will. But the grandchildren became a bridge, fragile and real. Marlene began bringing them on Sundays, and over the months I saw something change in my son. Slowly, the hard way, the only way that lasts. He started seeing someone, a therapist, and once standing awkwardly in my doorway, he told me that he was learning he had spent his whole life turning people into things he could use, and that I had been the first. I told him I was glad he was learning it. I did not tell him I forgave him, because I did not, and he did not ask me to, and there was a strange honesty in that, better than any forgiveness we could have faked. There was a night that winter before any of the softening came when I stood again at the kitchen sink and caught my own reflection in the dark window above it, the way I had the morning I first read the bank letter. The same tired eyes, the same raw cook's hands. But the woman looking back at me was not bracing for the next blow, not making herself small, not waiting to be told what she was worth. She had been asleep a long time, that woman, and now she was simply awake, and she held my gaze without flinching until I smiled at her, and she smiled back. One evening, late in the spring, with the windows open and the garden Frank had saved blooming outside, I made myself dinner. Not for 8 partners, not for 20 guests, not for anyone who would look through me as though I were furniture. Just for me. I set one place at my own table, in my own kitchen, in the house I had built and bought and bled for and taken back. I sat down, and I remembered a man standing over me on a Thanksgiving night, telling me I would go hungry so that I would learn to remember. I had remembered everything, and I was not hungry anymore. I picked up my fork and I ate.